Most people have a chance to see exciting events in their lives. I am the chief manager of an insurance office. I, too, have seen exciting things in my 30 years of work. My office had one wall that was covered in glass. I could see everybody who came into the insurance company. I liked to study the faces of new customers before I spoke to them. I decided what kind of people they were before they said a word to me. I learned to trust my first impression of people. The story I want to tell is about a man who came into the company one day. I watched him through the glass in my office. He seemed about 40 years old, and he was very well dressed. He seemed very polite, and he appeared to be quite a gentleman. He was talking to one of the clerks. Despite his appearance, I disliked this man as soon as I saw him. Suddenly, the man noticed that I was looking at him. He smiled at me through the glass. Then he took some papers from the clerk and left. A few minutes later, I called the clerk into my office. "Who was that man?" I asked him.
"That was Mr. Julius Slington, sir,"
the clerk told me.
"He's from the Middle Temple."
"What did he want?" I inquired.
"He wanted one of our insurance forms,"
the clerk replied.
"He said that a friend of yours recommended this company."
"He knew my name then, did he?"
"Oh, yes, Mr. Sampson,"
the clerk confirmed.
"He knew your name."
About 2 weeks later, I went to have dinner with a friend of mine. One of the other guests was Mr. Julius Slington. He was standing near the fire. He noticed me, and he asked our host to introduce him to me. Our host quickly brought him over. The three of us began to talk. "I thought you knew Mr. Sampson already," our host said.
"No,"
Mr. Slington told him.
"I followed your advice. I went into the insurance office, but I didn't speak to Mr. Sampson. I didn't want to disturb him."
"Did you come to the office to take out an insurance policy?" I asked Mr. Slington politely. "Was it a life insurance policy?"
"It's not a policy for me,"
Mr. Slington said.
"It's for a friend of mine. He asked me to get the information for him. I don't know whether he will take out the policy. People often change their minds, don't you think, Mr. Sampson?
Yes, I replied. We began to talk about other things.
Your profession has suffered a great loss,
Mr. Slington said suddenly. I did not know what he was talking about. A loss? I asked in surprise. What kind of loss, sir? A financial one? Mr. Slington laughed.
I don't mean a financial loss,
He explained.
I was referring to Mr. Meltham.
Now I understood what he was talking about. Ah, yes, Mr. Meltham, I agreed. That was indeed a sad loss. He was the most brilliant man I have ever known in the insurance profession. But did you know Mr. Meltham? I asked.
I knew his reputation,
Mr. Slington told me.
What a sad story it is. A young man like that suddenly gives up his business and retires from the world.
I have said that I disliked Mr. Slington when I first saw him in the insurance office. I still disliked him. I did not think he was really sad about Mr. Meltham at all. I decided to ask Mr. Slington some questions. I wanted to find out more about this man. Have you heard why Mr. Meltham left his business? I asked.
I have only heard stories about it,
He said.
Apparently, Mr. Meltham was unhappy in love.
That's not the truth, I told him. The truth is that the lady died.
She died, did she?
Mr. Slington repeated.
That's terrible. Poor Mr. Meltham. How very sad for him.
I still felt that Mr. Slington was not sincere. There was something false about his expression of sadness. Then he said to me,
You are surprised that Mr. Meltham's story affects me so strongly. I can see that, Mr. Sampson. But I too have suffered a terrible loss recently. I have 2 nieces, you see. One of them, a girl of 23, died recently. The other niece is also not well. The world is a very sad place.
Now I thought I understood Mr. Slington. He was a sensitive man who had suffered. I was angry with myself for disliking him. I watched him for the rest of the evening, and he seemed to be a good man. He talked politely to everybody, and everybody seemed to like him. I decided that my first impression of Mr. Slington was wrong. I spoke to our host about Mr. Slington. He told me that he had not known him for very long. He told me that Mr. Slington had taken his 2 nieces to Italy for their health. It was there that one of them had died. He had returned to England afterwards with his other niece. Now I felt that I understood Mr. Slington. I was deeply ashamed of my previous distrust of him. 2 days later, I was sitting in my office as usual. I saw Mr. Slington come into the outer office. As soon as I saw him, I disliked him again. Mr. Slington waved cheerfully at me and came into my office.
I have come back,
he said,
because I want to find out what my friend has done with the insurance forms. I want to know whether he has sent them back to the company. His family are worried about him, you see. They want him to buy a good insurance policy.
Perhaps I can help, I said. What is your friend's name, Mr. Slington? I asked him.
Beckwith,
he told me. I called the clerk into my office. I asked him to find out if a man called Beckwith had started an insurance policy with the company. The clerk searched through his files for a moment, and then he brought me some papers.
Yes, Mr. Sampson,
he said.
We received these forms from Mr. Beckwith. He wants a policy for £2,000. And he has asked Mr. Slington to write a reference for him.
Me?
Cried Mr. Slington in surprise. He thought for a moment.
But of course I can do that for him.
Mr. Slington sat down in my office and wrote the reference for Mr. Beckwith. He left the forms in my office, said goodbye politely, and then left. Mr. Slington was not my only visitor that day. Very early that morning, someone else had come to see me at my house. The visit was a very private one. No one knew anything about it at all. Mr. Beckwith's insurance policy began in March. I did not see Mr. Slington again for 6 or 7 months. I went to Scarborough in September, and I saw Mr. Slington walking on the beach there. It was early evening, and he greeted me warmly. Mr. Slington was with a young lady. He introduced me to her, explaining that she was his niece. Her name was Miss Niner. I looked at her carefully. I was sorry to see that Miss Niner did not look very well at all. As we walked along the sand, Mr. Slington pointed to some tracks in the sand. He laughed.
Ha ha ha, your shadow has been here again,
he joked to Miss Niner. Shadow? What shadow? I asked.
My uncle is joking, Mr. Sampson,
she explained.
There is an elderly gentleman here in Scarborough. He travels around in a hand carriage. I see him so often that my uncle calls him my shadow.
As she was speaking, we saw the old man's hand carriage come into sight. There was a frail old man inside. As the carriage was passing us, he waved his arm at me. He called to me by name. I went to see what he wanted. I was away from Mr. Slington and Miss Niner for about 5 minutes.
My niece is very curious,
Mr. Slington told me when I rejoined them.
She wants to know who her shadow is.
His name's Major Banks, I told him. He's a very rich man, but a very sick one. He's just been telling me what pleasure you both give him. He says it's obvious that you are very fond of one another.